When she's gone, the house is ours. My own daughter's words, whispered just on the other side of the screen door. The peach cobbler in my hands suddenly felt ice cold, its warmth a lie. The sweet smell of cinnamon choked me. For 10 years, I'd held onto a sealed envelope my husband left me, never understanding his warning. But what I was about to find inside would shatter my daughter's world. So stay with me, please, until the end. Subscribe if you feel a connection, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's from your phone at work or curled up on the couch at home. It helps to know I'm not alone. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 78 years old. Most mornings here in Maple Creek, the air tastes of pine and damp earth, a scent that always feels like a promise. My day begins with the roses Arthur planted, their velvety heads heavy with dew. My hands, gnarled and spotted from decades of pushing a needle through silk and satin for other. People's happiest days are gentle with them. This small ritual, tending to his flowers, has been my anchor for the 10 years he's been gone. A quiet conversation with a ghost in the garden. The house itself is an extension of him. He built it with his own 2 hands, and you can feel his sturdiness in the solid oak floors that don't creak, and the deep windowsills that catch the morning light. For a decade, its silence has been a comfort, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was my sanctuary, a place where the memories were so thick they felt like a warm blanket against the chill of being alone in the world. But Sundays were different. Sundays were the antidote to the silence. That was the day the house would breathe again, filled with the sounds of my daughter, Sharon, her husband, Mark, and my granddaughter, Chloe. The entire morning was a ritual of preparation, the air slowly filling with the rich, savory smell of the pot. Roast that had been my mother's recipe and hers before that. I believed that meal was more than just food. It was the glue holding us together, proof that the love I poured out was returned in full. That afternoon, the air was thick and humid, the kind that presses down on you in the North Carolina mountains just before a storm. I was carrying the peach cobbler, its top a perfect golden brown, out to the porch where they were all sitting. The screen door was slightly ajar, and as I reached for the handle, I heard Sharon's voice. It was low, conspiratorial, and sharp as broken glass. "Don't worry, hun," she was saying into her phone. "Her health isn't what it used to be. When she's gone, the house is ours. We'll sell this old place, pay off our debts, and finally get out of this hole." The ceramic dish trembled in my hands. A sudden, violent coldness shot through my chest, so intense it stole my breath. It was as if the world had narrowed to that single venomous whisper coming through the screen. The sweet, comforting scent of baked peaches and cinnamon that had filled my kitchen all afternoon suddenly turned sickly, cloying. I couldn't smell it without feeling a wave of nausea. Every happy memory associated with that smell was instantly corrupted, poisoned by her words. I was paralyzed. My feet were rooted to the worn floorboards of the kitchen, my body hidden from view by the angle of the door. I couldn't move forward to confront her, and I couldn't retreat. I just stood there, a prisoner in my own home, listening as her voice continued, punctuated by the muffled, agreeable sounds from Mark on the other end of the line. The betrayal wasn't just an impulsive, cruel thought from my daughter. It was a shared plan, a future they were building on the foundation of my grave. Somehow, my body took over when my mind couldn't. My feet, moving without instruction, took a silent step back, then another. I retreated into the kitchen's shadows, placing the heavy dish of cobbler onto the countertop with hands that shook so badly the dessert slid against the side of the ceramic. The silence I had returned to was no longer comforting. It was vast and terrifying, a vacuum where the sounds of my family's love used to be. It was the sound of being utterly and completely alone. Just as I leaned against the counter, trying to draw a steadying breath, the screen door creaked open. "Mom?" Sharon called out, her voice now light and cheerful, a perfect imitation of a loving daughter. "Is the dessert about ready?" The casual warmth in her tone was the cruelest part of it all. It was a performance, and I was now an unwilling participant. I had no idea how I was going to turn around and face her without my entire world crumbling at my feet. The muscles in my face felt like they might crack as I forced them into a smile. It was a stiff, brittle thing, something I didn't recognize as my own. I kept my back to her for another second, gripping the edge of the granite countertop until my knuckles were white. "Almost, dear," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears, just letting it set for a moment. The lie felt like swallowing dust, scratching my throat on the way down. Sharon bustled into the kitchen, the scent of her expensive floral perfume immediately overwhelming the homey smell of my cooking. It was a scent for the outside world, for offices and restaurants, and it felt so alien here. She didn't look at me directly, her attention already on the screen of her phone as she typed a quick message. It was a small thing, that avoidance of my eyes, but it suddenly felt like a habit I had been too blind to notice before. She finally looked up, her smile practiced. "Smells wonderful, Mom. You shouldn't go to so much trouble." The words were meant to sound caring, but now I heard the subtext. "You're old, you're frail, you should be resting instead of using up your energy on us." Every word was a reminder of her impatience, a gentle nudge toward the decline she was so eagerly anticipating. I just nodded, unable to form a real response. My granddaughter, Chloe, bounced in then, a whirlwind of teenage energy with white earbuds dangling from her neck. "Grandma," she said, giving me a quick one-armed hug before pulling away to peer at the dessert on the counter. "Peach cobbler! Yes!" Her innocence was a sharp pang in my chest. Did she know? Was she part of this cold calculation? Or was she just a child, oblivious to the quiet greed of her parents? I wanted to hold on to her, to find a spark of genuine affection, but she was already gone, lost in her own world. Sitting around the big oak table for dinner was a special kind of torture. The pot roast I had tended to with such love all day tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I could barely swallow. I just pushed the food around on my plate, watching them. I watched Mark take a big bite and close his eyes in performative bliss. "Eleanor, this is incredible. Best one yet." I watched Sharon laugh at something he said, a bright, false sound that didn't reach her eyes. They were such good actors. Had they always been? I started studying them, really looking at their faces for the first time in a long time. Mark's easygoing smile, the one I'd always found so charming, now looked like the practiced grin of a salesman closing a deal. And my daughter. I searched her face for the little girl I had raised, the one who used to bury her face in my apron. Instead, I saw a woman looking at her mother with an expression of clinical assessment. She was checking for new wrinkles, for a tremor in my hand, for any sign that the end was getting closer. Inevitably, the conversation drifted toward their finances. They spoke in vague, coded terms about the rising cost of everything, the impossibility of getting ahead, the weight of their credit card debt. "It's just a struggle to keep our heads above water, you know," Sharon said, her gaze landing on me with a heavy, meaningful weight. It wasn't just a complaint about her life. It was an explanation, a justification for the thoughts she was having. My house, my life, was the life raft they felt entitled to. Mark reached across the table and patted my hand. His skin was cool and dry against mine. "Don't you worry about a thing, Eleanor. We always manage to figure things out." His touch was meant to be reassuring, but it felt like a cold seal on a contract I hadn't agreed to sign. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that the words I'd overheard weren't a fleeting moment of frustration. They were the tip of an iceberg, a long-held, carefully discussed plan. Then came the dessert. I served the peach cobbler with a steady hand I didn't know I possessed, spooning it into bowls and topping it with the vanilla ice cream Chloe loved. Sharon took a bite, and a look of genuine pleasure crossed her face. "Oh, Mom, this is divine. You've really outdone yourself." The hypocrisy was so profound, so shameless, that I felt a wave of dizziness. How could she savor the food I made with love while actively wishing for my death? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. We sat on the porch swing, the same one Arthur had hung the year Sharon was born. The Blue Ridge Mountains were a soft, hazy purple in the distance. beautiful and indifferent. They talked about a vacation to the beach they couldn't afford and a newer car Mark was looking at online. Every word, every dream they shared was funded by a fantasy of my demise. My home wasn't a place for memories. It was a checking account they were waiting to cash. My mind kept slipping back in time, unspooling memories in this very house. I saw a flash of Sharon as a toddler, taking her first wobbly steps across these porch floorboards. I remembered sitting in the spare room, surrounded by bolts of white lace, sewing the tiny pearls onto her wedding dress. My fingers aching, but my heart full. Were those moments real? To her? Or were they just entries in a ledger, favors to be repaid with an inheritance? The loneliness was no longer a quiet ache. It was a physical presence sitting beside me on the swing. I was surrounded by the 3 people who were supposed to be my entire world. And yet, I had never felt so profoundly alone. The family I had dedicated my life to, the love I thought was my greatest creation, was a fiction. It was a comfortable story we had all agreed to believe, but the final chapter had already been written by them, and it ended with me gone. Now I saw the signs everywhere, clues I had missed for years. I saw the way Sharon's eyes would sweep over the living room, not with nostalgia, but with a cool, appraising gaze, as if she were taking inventory. I remembered the offhand comments Mark would make about property values in the area, disguised as casual conversation. The evidence had been there all along, but I had been too busy loving them to see the truth. They finally stood, to leave as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The hugs at the door felt like the embraces of strangers, their bodies stiff and their touch fleeting. "We love you, Mom," Sharon said, her lips brushing my cheek. The words were a final, twisting knife in a wound that was already impossibly deep. I watched their car's red taillights disappear down the gravel drive until they were swallowed by the twilight. I remained in the doorway for a long time after they were gone, letting the evening chill seep into my bones. The house, my sanctuary, my fortress of memory, suddenly felt alien. It was no longer a home. It was a prize, a piece of property they were waiting to claim. I looked down at my own hands, the hands that had rocked my daughter to sleep and sewn her clothes and cooked her meals, and they seemed impossibly frail and useless. A suffocating feeling of being trapped washed over me. They were right about one thing. My health wasn't what it used to be. My heart ached, my knees were stiff, and the thought of fighting them, of confronting this monstrous truth, was utterly exhausting. For a fleeting, dark moment, I wondered if it would just be easier to let it happen, to fade away and give them what they wanted. The despair was a heavy blanket, threatening to smother what little strength I had left. I felt like a ghost haunting the rooms of my own life, just waiting for the end they had planned for me. There was no one to call, no one to turn to. I was completely cornered by the people I was meant to trust most, and it was there, in that pit of absolute desolation, that a memory surfaced, faint at first, and then with sudden clarity. I remembered Arthur's last days, his voice a dry whisper against my ear, telling me about a large brown envelope sealed with red wax, hidden away for the day I felt completely and utterly betrayed. The memory of Arthur's words didn't arrive like a gentle whisper from the past. It slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. "Only open this if you ever feel completely alone and betrayed," he had said, his voice raspy in the sterile quiet of the hospital room. At the time, I dismissed it as the rambling of a man facing his own mortality, a strange, dramatic gesture. Now, his foresight was a chilling presence in the room. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage, and his words were the key I had forgotten I possessed. I moved through the silent house like a sleepwalker, my feet finding their way to our bedroom. The air was stale with the lingering scent of their visit. Sharon's sharp perfume, Mark's cologne, the faint sweetness of the cobbler on their breath. I knelt on the floor, the old rug scratching my knees, and reached under the heavy oak bed frame. My fingers brushed against the familiar, rough-sawn wood of the chest Arthur had made from a fallen cedar on our property. It was heavy, filled with a lifetime of linens and keepsakes, and pulling it out was a struggle. The groan of the wood against the floorboards was the only sound in the world. Lifting the lid released the scent of cedar and lavender, a smell that had always meant comfort and preservation. Inside, nestled among my carefully folded wedding veil and Chloe's christening gown, everything looked untouched, a museum of a life I no longer recognized. My hands trembled as I lifted out the layers of fabric, each piece a memory. The weight of them felt unbearable. I had protected these relics, believing they were the foundation of our family. I was a fool. I had been curating a beautiful lie. Beneath the last layer of silk, my fingers found the small, almost invisible notch Arthur had shown me once, years ago. He'd called it his little secret. A slight push, a slide to the left, and a section of the chest's floor lifted away. There, in the shallow, hidden compartment, lay the envelope. It was large and brown, made of thick, unyielding paper. The wax seal was a deep, angry red, stamped with the simple initial V from his old signet ring. It looked like a drop of blood on the dry, aged paper. For a long moment, I just stared at it. This was the turning point. Opening it meant admitting that my husband saw a potential for betrayal in my own daughter long before I ever did. It felt like a disloyalty to both of them. To Arthur for doubting his foresight, and to Sharon for finally believing the worst of her. A part of me, the mother who had kissed, scraped. Knees and soothed nightmares, wanted to push the false bottom back into place, slide the chest under the bed, and pretend this day never happened. I could just let them have the house when I was gone. I could spare myself this pain, this confrontation. What did a house matter in the end? The thought was seductive in its simplicity, a quiet surrender. But then I saw their faces again, heard Sharon's whisper, "When she's gone." It wasn't just about the house. It was about my life being an inconvenience, a line item in their budget, an obstacle to be weathered. They weren't waiting for an inheritance. They were waiting for me to die. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged, painful sound. The despair I felt on the porch began to burn away, replaced by something else, something cold and hard and unfamiliar. It was a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. Arthur hadn't been paranoid. He had been a protector. He had seen the small seeds of greed and entitlement that my love had made me blind to. He wasn't leaving me a burden. He was leaving me a shield. Or maybe, I thought as my fingers finally closed around the stiff paper, he was leaving me a sword. The sound of the paper tearing as I broke the seal was shockingly loud in the stillness of the room. It was a definitive, irrevocable sound. The end of one story and the beginning of another. There was no going back. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the contents. It wasn't just a letter. There was a sheaf of official-looking documents held together with a metal clip and a small, tarnished brass key. My heart pounded against my ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. I unfolded the letter first. It was Arthur's handwriting, the familiar, strong cursive, though slightly shakier than I remembered. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, then the world has failed you in a way I always feared it might. I pray you never have to, but I couldn't leave this world without giving you a final anchor. I love you more than these words can say, and that love includes protecting you, even after I'm gone." The ink was slightly faded, but the words were a direct line to him, a voice from the grave filled with a sorrowful love. He wrote about his pride in the home he'd built, not as a collection of wood and nails, but as a testament to our life together. He said he saw a grasping nature in Mark, a man who always seemed to be calculating angles, and it worried him. He saw how easily Sharon was swayed by the promise of an easier life, a trait he feared would curdle into something ugly over time. He wasn't condemning them, he wrote, but he couldn't leave our sanctuary vulnerable to their impatience. The documents were legal papers, thick and filled with jargon I didn't immediately understand. But as I read through them, a single phrase jumped out, repeated on several pages. The Maple Creek Homestead Trust. Arthur, my simple, hard-working husband, had secretly placed the house and the land it stood on into an irrevocable trust years before he fell ill. He had never told me. The trust was set up with a single, unchangeable purpose: to provide me with a home for the remainder of my natural life. I was the sole lifetime beneficiary. I had the absolute right to live here, to enjoy the property as my own, until my final breath. But I was not the owner. I could not sell it. And upon my passing, the ownership did not automatically transfer to Sharon. The trust documents were crystal clear on that point. A cold shock ran through me, a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, fierce sense of awe at my husband's quiet cunning. He had truly thought of everything. The papers stipulated that upon my death, the property was to be managed by a local bank, acting as the trustee. Sharon would be given the option to purchase the house from the trust at its full, professionally appraised market value. If she could not, or would not, the house was to be sold on the open market. The proceeds, after all expenses, were not to go to her directly. Arthur had outlined a different plan. The money was to be placed into a separate educational trust for Chloe and any future grandchildren, accessible to them only upon their 25th birthdays. Sharon and Mark would not be able to touch a single penny. They would get nothing from the sale of the home they were so eagerly waiting to liquidate. The house wasn't their retirement plan. It was their daughter's future, locked away from their greedy hands. My own hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled. It was a masterful move, a piece of strategic brilliance I never would have imagined from the man who fell asleep in his armchair every night watching baseball. He hadn't disinherited his daughter out of spite. He had simply created a firewall, protecting his legacy and his granddaughter from the very weakness he had observed in her parents. He was ensuring his hard work would build a future, not just pay off credit card bills. The small brass key, I now realized, was for a safe deposit box at the downtown bank. The letter explained it held the original, notarized copies of the trust. The ones in my hand were just that, copies. The real power, the legally binding truth, was locked away in a steel box, waiting. Arthur had ensured that his plan was ironclad, protected from any challenge or emotional appeal they might try to launch after I was gone. I sat back on my heels, the documents spread across, the floor around me like fallen leaves. The weight that had been crushing my chest all evening began to lift. It wasn't gone, but it had changed. The suffocating helplessness was gone, replaced by a cold, steadying anger. My daughter and her husband had been playing a long, patient game, treating me like a pawn in their financial strategy. They had no idea that my quiet, unassuming husband had made his final move a decade ago. I thought about their smug smiles at the dinner table, Mark's condescending pat on my hand, Sharon's clinical assessment of my health. They saw a frail old woman, a relic, a placeholder. They had no idea I was the gatekeeper. They looked at this house and saw a windfall, a quick fix for their problems. They didn't see the love, the sweat, the years of sacrifice baked into its very foundations. Arthur had seen it, and he had protected it. The initial shock gave way to a profound sense of peace. This wasn't about revenge. I wouldn't scream or cry or confront them with their own ugliness. That was their way, not mine. My path was quieter, more deliberate. Arthur had given me a tool, and I would use it with the same precision he had used to build this house, beam by beam. The game was not over. In fact, it had just begun, and I finally understood the rules. I carefully folded Arthur's letter and placed it back in the envelope. The legal documents felt heavy in my hand, heavy with the weight of a decision. For a moment, I considered just keeping them, hidden. I could live out my days in peace, and they would only discover the truth after I was gone. It would be a final, silent victory, but that felt like a coward's way out. It would let their disrespect continue to fester in the silence. No, the truth couldn't stay buried, but it had to be revealed on my terms, in my own time. My mind started working, the gears turning for the first time in years with a sense of purpose beyond baking and gardening. The fog of grief and loneliness that had clouded my life for a decade was burning away. I was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the widow, the mother, the grandmother. I was the protector of Arthur's legacy. I looked around the room, at the furniture he had polished, the curtains I had sewn, the photos on the wall of a family that was both real and an illusion. For 10 years, I had been living in a museum of the past. Now I felt a spark of the future. It wasn't the future I had ever wanted, one defined by a quiet, painful battle with my own child, but it was the one I had been given, and I would not back down from it. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest, but I felt taller than I had in years. I gathered the documents, my movements now steady and sure. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The Sunday dinners were not over. Oh no, they were more important now than ever. But the next one would be different. The menu would be the same, the conversation just as pleasant. But underneath it all, I would be setting a new table, one where the truth would finally be served. This envelope wasn't just a revelation. It was an instruction. It was Arthur's final gift, not of wealth, but of strength. He had reminded me who I was, not a fragile old woman waiting to die, but the mistress of this house, the guardian of its future. The doubt was gone, evaporated by the stark clarity of his words and the legal power of his documents. I accepted the call for what it was, a duty to honor the man I loved and to protect the life we built together. The morning after was a stranger. For the first time in a decade, I didn't wake up with the ghost of Arthur beside me. I woke up with his last command echoing in the quiet room. The documents lay on my nightstand, a testament to a truth I could no longer ignore. My first instinct was to hide them again, to pretend I hadn't seen them, to go back to the comfortable sadness I knew so well. That was the old Eleanor, the one who smoothed things over and absorbed the pain of others. But she had died on the porch yesterday, holding a peach cobbler that had turned to poison in her hands. My first real step was small, almost laughably so. I put on my good walking shoes, the ones I saved for doctor's appointments, and I walked to the end of my gravel driveway. I just stood there, looking at the road that led into town. It felt like a vast, foreign country. For years, my world had shrunk to the size of this house and garden, my only regular trips out being with Sharon at the wheel. Kantain. Thought of taking the local bus, of navigating the bank by myself, filled me with a paralyzing dread. I almost turned back 3 times, the fear of seeming frail and confused in public a powerful chain on my ankles. But the image of Sharon's face, her lips forming those devastating words, was a stronger force. I walked back inside, not in defeat, but with a new purpose. I found the bus schedule in a kitchen drawer, its paper yellowed and folded into a tiny square. I spent the next hour studying it, my finger tracing the route to downtown Maple Creek as if it were a map to a hidden treasure. It was a simple thing, a bus schedule. But in that moment, it felt like I was learning to read a new language, the language of my own independence. This was my first lesson. My world was only as small as I allowed it to be. The next day, I made the journey. The bus ride was jarring. The hiss of the air brakes and the chatter of strangers a stark contrast to the insulated silence of Sharon's SUV. The bank, the marble floors and high ceilings seemed designed to make a person feel small. I clutched the brass key in my pocket, its sharp edges a constant reminder of my mission. When I presented it to the young woman behind the counter, my voice was barely a whisper. I felt like an imposter, a little old lady playing a role she hadn't rehearsed. She looked at me with a professional, impersonal kindness that felt colder than outright suspicion. Inside the vault, the air was cold and still. The teller used a second key, and the sound of the lock turning was a heavy, final click. He slid out the long metal box and placed it on a small table in a private viewing room, leaving me alone. For a moment, I just stared at it. This box was the physical manifestation of Arthur's foresight. It was a promise he had made to me from beyond the grave. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift the lid. Inside, resting on top of a stack of neatly bound documents, was another, smaller envelope, with my name on it. This letter was different from the first. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about strength. "Eleanor," Arthur wrote, "these papers are your shield. But a shield is useless if you don't know how to hold it. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to be strong. The woman I married was never a fragile flower. She was the oak tree that weathered every storm. Remember her." Reading those words, in that cold, silent room, felt like he was standing right beside me, lending me his strength. The fear I'd been carrying began to recede, replaced by a quiet, solid resolve. I spent the next week in a self-imposed boot camp. I didn't just read the trust documents, I studied them. I bought a legal dictionary from the town's only bookstore and sat at my kitchen table for hours, looking up words like beneficiary, trustee, and irrevocable. I made notes in the margins, my handwriting shaky at first, then becoming firmer with each page. I was arming myself with knowledge, building a fortress of understanding around Arthur's legal fortress. The house was no longer filled with the ghosts of the past. It was filled with the purpose of the future. My old habits began to change, subtly at first. I still tended to the roses, but now I did it for me, for the simple joy of seeing them bloom, not as a tribute to a shared memory. I started cooking meals I enjoyed, not just the pot roast and casseroles that Sharon and Mark preferred. I made a spicy jambalaya one night, a dish they would have hated, and the unfamiliar aroma of cayenne and thyme felt like a declaration of independence. I was reclaiming my own home, my own tastes, my own life, one small act at a time. The following Sunday, when they arrived, I was ready. I wasn't the same woman they had left on the porch a week ago. I was calmer, more distant. I watched them from a place of newfound clarity. I saw the way Mark's eyes scanned the living room, not with affection for a family home, but with the cold calculation of an appraiser. I heard the way Sharon peppered her conversation with complaints about money, each one a carefully placed probe, testing my sympathy, checking for a weakness she could exploit. They noticed the change in me, of course. "You seem quiet today, Mom," Sharon said, her voice laced with that false concern I now saw for what it was. "Are you feeling all right?" The old me would have rushed to reassure her, to apologize for being a poor host. The new me simply met her gaze and said, "I'm feeling perfectly clear, thank you." The simple, direct answer left her momentarily speechless. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I had refused to play my part in her script. The biggest test came after dinner. Mark, in his charming offhand way, mentioned that his car needed a new transmission, a repair that was going to cost them thousands. He sighed dramatically, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't know how we're going to swing it," he said, looking directly at me. The air grew thick with expectation. This was the moment I was supposed to offer to help, to dip into the savings Arthur and I had so carefully built. It was a scene we had played out a dozen times before. I took a slow sip of my iced tea, letting the silence stretch. I could feel their impatience, a tangible thing in the humid afternoon air. Finally, I set my glass down and looked at him, not with pity, but with a polite, detached interest. "That does sound very stressful." "Mark," I said, "I hope you find a way to work it out." The shock on their faces was a sight to behold. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was pure, unadulterated confusion. Their most reliable tool, my guilt, had suddenly stopped working, and they had no idea why. That night, after they left in a cloud of bewildered silence, I felt a tremor of my old fear. Had I been too cold, too cruel? The ingrained habit of a lifetime, the instinct to be the family's emotional caretaker, fought against my new resolve. I sat in Arthur's armchair, the trust documents in my lap, and I felt the weight of my decision. This path was a lonely one. It meant severing the illusion of the loving family I had cherished for so long. The grief was real, a sharp, painful ache for something that had never truly existed. But as the days turned into another week, that grief was replaced by something else, a growing sense of self-respect. I had spent my entire life putting the needs and feelings of others before my own. I had sewn hundreds of wedding dresses, pouring my heart into the dreams of other women, while my own dreams were quietly folded away. Now, for the first time, I was taking up space in my own life. I was the main character, not a supporting role in my daughter's financial drama. My next step was the hardest. Following Arthur's advice, I made an appointment with a lawyer, a woman whose name I got from the trust officer at the bank. Walking into her office was even more intimidating than the bank vault. But Ms. Albright was nothing like I expected. She was sharp and kind, with eyes that saw everything. I didn't have to explain the hurt or the betrayal. I just laid out the facts and showed her the documents. She read them in silence, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she looked up at me over the top of her glasses. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Your husband was a very smart man. This trust is ironclad. You are in complete control." Hearing those words from a legal authority, from a stranger, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't just my interpretation of Arthur's wishes. It was the law. She explained my rights, my options, and the legal firewall that protected me from any and all claims. The fear of being challenged, of being seen as a confused old woman, finally evaporated. I began to feel a confidence I hadn't felt since I was a young woman running my own seamstress business. I started taking walks around the neighborhood, not just to the end of the driveway. I reconnected with an old friend from my church, someone I had drifted away from after Arthur's passing. I went to a matinee movie by myself for the first time in 50 years. Each small act of independence was another stitch in the fabric of my new self, creating a pattern of strength and resilience. The Sunday dinners continued, but they had become a strange, silent battlefield. Sharon and Mark had shifted their tactics from subtle manipulation to a more overt form of passive aggression. They would talk about their friends whose parents had helped them out with a down payment on a new house, or mention how lucky some people were to have family they could count on. Each comment was a dart aimed at my heart, but now I had a shield. Their words no longer wounded me. They simply bounced off the cold, hard truth of my situation. My internal conflict now was not about whether I was being cruel, but about how and when I would reveal the truth. The lawyer had advised me to wait, to gather my strength and choose my moment carefully. "The person who controls the information controls the power," she'd said. So I waited, and I watched. I saw the impatience in their eyes turning to a quiet resentment. They were beginning to see me not just as an obstacle, but as a willful one. My perceived senility was being replaced by a perceived selfishness. One afternoon, Chloe, my granddaughter, stayed behind for a few minutes after her parents left. She sat with me on the porch swing, a rare moment of quiet between us. "Are you okay, Grandma?" she asked, her young face filled with a genuine concern that twisted my heart. "Mom and Dad are acting weird. They keep whispering about you." I looked at her, this innocent girl caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand, and for a moment, my resolve wavered. I wanted to protect her from this ugliness, but then I remembered Arthur's plan. This wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about protecting her. The trust was for her future, a future her parents would gladly cash in for a new car and a beach vacation. I reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just remember that I love you very much, and your grandpa did too. He always wanted to make sure you were taken care of." It was a cryptic thing to say, but it was the truest thing I could offer her at that moment. The progress I was making was invisible to them, but it was monumental to me. I learned how to pay my bills online, something I had always relied on Mark to help me with. I arranged for a handyman to fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom, a task I would have previously waited for Mark to get around to. Each task I completed on my own was a small declaration that I was not helpless. I was not a burden. I was the capable, resourceful woman I had always been, a woman I was finally meeting again. The shift inside me was profound. I stopped thinking of the house as a place they would one day take over. I started making plans for it, for me. I thought about turning the spare bedroom into a proper sewing room again, a space just for me, filled with light and color and bolts of fabric. I dreamed of planting a vegetable garden in the spring. These weren't the dreams of a woman waiting to die. They were the plans of a woman who was finally starting to live again, on her own terms. My final transformation happened during what would be our last normal Sunday dinner. Sharon was talking about a wonderful retirement community she had visited, one with full-time nursing care and organized activities. She described it in glowing terms, her voice bright and enthusiastic. "It would be so perfect for you, Mom. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." It was the most audacious move she had made yet, actively trying to sell me on the idea of moving into an asylum so they could get their hands on the house faster. A year ago, even a month ago, that comment would have shattered me. I would have seen it as a final, cruel rejection. But as I sat there, listening to her sales pitch, I felt nothing but a strange, cold pity for her. She was so blinded by her own greed that she couldn't see the woman sitting in front of her. She was talking to a ghost, a figment of her imagination, a weak, compliant old woman who no longer existed. I didn't argue or protest. I simply looked at her, a small, knowing smile on my lips, and let her finish. When she was done, I picked up the empty serving dish from the center of the table. "Who wants the last piece of cobbler?" I asked, my voice even and calm. In that moment, I knew I was no longer the same person. The fear was gone. The hurt was gone. The naive mother who lived for her daughter's approval was gone. In her place was Eleanor Vance, the mistress of Maple Creek Homestead, and I was finally ready to set my own table. The final Sunday arrived not with a storm, but with the quiet, unnerving calm that precedes one. I woke up feeling a stillness inside me that I hadn't known for years, a solid core where the anxious flutter of pleasing others used to be. The woman who once measured her worth by the clean plates and happy smiles of her family was gone. In her place was a woman who was preparing for a different kind of gathering. This meal wasn't an offering of love. It was a stage, and I was finally directing the play. I was no longer the frail old woman they saw, but the guardian of a legacy they had, foolishly underestimated. My movements were deliberate, imbued with a new sense of ownership. As I polished the old oak dining table, I saw my own reflection in the wood, and for the first time, I didn't see a widow fading into the background. I saw Eleanor Vance. The copies of Arthur's documents were tucked inside a simple manila envelope, which I placed in the top drawer of the sideboard. They were a hidden weight in the room, a silent testament to a truth that would soon be spoken. The pot. Roast simmered on the stove, its familiar, comforting scent filling a house that no longer felt like a waiting room for my own departure. When their car crunched up the gravel driveway, I didn't rush to the door with a practiced smile. I waited for them to knock. The contrast was immediate. Sharon's hug was brief and tense, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something out of place. Mark's jovial greeting felt hollow, a performance for an audience that was no longer buying a ticket. They were on edge, their patience worn thin by my recent refusal to be their emotional and financial safety net. They could feel the power dynamic had shifted, even if they couldn't possibly understand how. Dinner was an exercise in strained civility. They spoke of their mounting bills with a pointedness that bordered on aggression. Their words no longer veiled hints, but direct emotional projectiles. They were trying to corner me, to force the guilt that had always been their most effective weapon. I simply listened, nodding politely, offering no solutions, no sympathy, just the quiet attention of a disinterested observer. I was watching them from across a vast canyon of betrayal, seeing them not as my family, but as two desperate people who had made a terrible miscalculation. The moment came, as I knew it would, over dessert. Sharon pushed her half-eaten cobbler aside and folded her hands on the table, adopting the tone of someone about to deliver a difficult but necessary truth. "Mom," she began, her voice dripping with condescending care, "we really need to talk about your future. That lovely community I mentioned, Silver Pines, they have a rare opening. It's safe, and you'd have professional care around the clock. You wouldn't have to worry about this big old house all by yourself." Her words hung in the air, the final shameless move in her long game. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my own dessert, savoring the sweetness of the peaches, a taste I had reclaimed as my own. I let the silence stretch until it was taut and uncomfortable for them. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to grow louder with each passing second. I saw the impatience flash in Mark's eyes. Then, I gently placed my fork on my plate, the soft clink of metal on ceramic the only sound. "That won't be necessary, Sharon," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. "My future is right here, in this house." Her face tightened. "Don't be stubborn, Mom. We're trying to help you. This place is too much for you." It was the same old script, the same tired lines. I rose from my chair, my movements fluid and steady. I walked to the sideboard, every eye in the room following me. I opened the top drawer and removed the manila envelope. The paper felt cool and powerful in my hands. I returned to the table and placed it in the center, between the salt and pepper shakers. A final, unexpected course for our Sunday dinner. "What's this?" Mark asked, a flicker of suspicion in his voice. "More old photos?" I looked from his face to my daughter's, letting them see the quiet finality in my eyes. "This," I said softly, "is Arthur's final word on the matter. I think you both should read it." The color drained from Sharon's face as she tentatively reached for the envelope. Her hands, usually so steady and capable, trembled as she unclasped it and slid the documents out. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of the thick legal paper. Watched as she read, her eyes scanning the first page, then frantically jumping to the next. I saw the exact moment the truth landed, the subtle shift from confusion to disbelief, and then to a raw, uncomprehending horror. She shoved the papers across the table to Mark, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Read it," she choked out. "Just read it." Mark picked them up, his salesman's smile gone, replaced by a grim, focused frown. His face hardened as he absorbed the ironclad legal jargon that dismantled their entire future. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a vacuum filled with the death of their expectations, the collapse of their decade-long plan. The ticking of the clock was a merciless countdown to the end of our charade. Finally, Sharon looked up at me, her face a mask of fury and betrayal. "How could he?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "How could our own father do this to me? To his only daughter?" Her pain was real, but it was the pain of a thwarted thief, not a grieving child. I met her gaze without flinching, my heart aching not for her loss of an inheritance, but for the daughter I had truly lost so long ago. "He didn't do this to you, Sharon," I said, my voice still quiet but now filled with the strength of Arthur's conviction. "He did this for Chloe. He did this to protect the home we built from impatience and greed. He wanted his granddaughter to have a foundation for her future, not a quick fix for your debts." The truth, spoken plainly, had none of the explosive drama I had feared. It was just a cold, hard fact, undeniable and absolute. Mark threw the papers down on the table as if they had burned his hands. "This is ridiculous. We can fight this. She's old. She's clearly not in her right mind," he started, his voice rising with panic. But he stopped himself because he looked at me and saw, for the very first time, that the woman he was talking about was not in the room. He saw the clarity in my eyes, the steadiness of my hands, and he knew it was over. There was no loophole. There was no confused old woman to manipulate. There was only the trust, and it was irrevocable. Their departure was not like any other. There were no false hugs, no empty "I love yous." There was only the scrape of chairs against the floor, the slam of the screen door, and the sound of their car engine roaring to life before peeling down the driveway, spitting gravel in its wake. They left behind a half-eaten dessert and the wreckage of a family built on a lie. I stood at the window and watched their taillights disappear, just as I had the week before, but this time, I felt no despair. Alone in the now silent house, I did not feel a rush of victory. Instead, a profound, cleansing wave of peace washed over me. The oppressive weight of their expectations, a burden I had carried for years without even realizing it, was finally gone. The house sighed around me, as if it too could finally breathe. Dry. Silence was no longer empty. It was serene. It was the sound of my own life, waiting to be lived. I walked through the rooms, touching the familiar furniture, no longer seeing ghosts of the past, but seeing the canvas of my future. The transformation was not just internal, it became tangible in the weeks that followed. The spare room, once a storage space for memories and forgotten things, was slowly reborn. I set up my old sewing machine, oiled its gears, and laid out bolts of bright, colorful fabric. The hum of the machine filled the house, a sound of creation, of purpose. It was the sound of Eleanor, the seamstress, the artist, coming back to life. I was no longer just tending to Arthur's roses. I was planting my own vegetable garden, my hands in the rich soil, cultivating something that would nourish me. Before, I was a woman who was afraid to take the bus into town, a woman whose world had shrunk to the four walls of her grief. Now, I was a woman who hosted a book club with friends from church, who took a pottery class on Thursdays, who drove her own car to the grocery store and bought whatever she pleased. The change was so profound that people noticed. "Eleanor, you look wonderful," my friend Carol said one afternoon. "There's a light in your eyes I haven't seen in years." She was right. It was the light of a woman who had reclaimed her own soul. Chloe began visiting on her own, taking the bus from school. Our relationship, once filtered through the tense lens of her parents, began to blossom. We didn't speak of the fight, not directly. Instead, we talked about her dreams, her fears, her future. I saw the goodness in her, the spirit Arthur had sought to protect. In her eyes, I wasn't an obstacle or a bank account. I was just her grandma. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that Arthur's final gift had been the right one. The love in my family hadn't died. It had simply been purified. Looking back, I realized the woman who stood on that porch, paralyzed by her daughter's words, was a stranger to me now. She was a ghost of a life lived for others. My conquest wasn't over Sharon and Mark. It was over the fear that had kept me small and silent for so long. The greatest victory was not in keeping the house, but in finding my own voice within its walls. I had learned to say no, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of self-preservation. The sealed envelope from Arthur held more than just legal documents. It held a mirror. It forced me to see the truth not only of my daughter's greed, but of my own complicity in my own erasure. I had allowed my identity to be consumed by the roles of mother and wife, forgetting the woman who existed before them. His final act of love was not just to protect my home, but to give me back to myself. It was a key, not just to a safe deposit box, but to a cage I hadn't even realized I was in. My life is quieter now, but it is infinitely more full. The house is filled not with the ghosts of what was, but with the vibrant possibilities of what is to come. The smell of baking bread, the hum of my sewing machine, the laughter of my friends. These are the sounds of my home now. It is a sanctuary I defended, a fortress of peace I earned not through a battle of wills, but through a quiet revolution of the self. My hands, once gnarled from sewing for others, are now busy creating a life that is entirely my own. The journey was painful, a tearing away of illusions I had, cherished for a lifetime. But on the other side of that pain, I found a strength I never knew I possessed. I learned that true independence isn't about being alone. It's about being whole on your own terms. It's about respecting yourself enough to demand that others do the same. The love I give now is not a desperate plea to be needed, but a calm, steady offering from a heart that is full and free. I share this story not for pity or for praise, but as a testament to the quiet power that lies within all of us, especially when we feel most invisible. It is the power to redraw the boundaries that others have set for us, to reclaim the narrative of our own lives. Dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is something we must choose to inhabit, especially when the world tries to convince us we are nothing more than a placeholder. My before and after is not a dramatic transformation seen by the world, but a seismic shift felt within my own soul. I went from being the caretaker of a museum of memories to the architect of my own future. I learned that the most profound acts of courage are often the quietest. The decision to read a letter, to take a bus, to speak a simple truth, to choose yourself when everyone else has counted you out. To anyone listening who feels unseen, who feels their life is a footnote in someone else's story, my message is this: your life is the main text. Do not be afraid to turn the page, even if your hands are shaking. The ending has not yet been written, and you alone, are the one holding the pen. The conquest is not over others. It is the beautiful, terrifying, and ultimately liberating conquest of becoming who you were always meant to be. The greatest gift Arthur gave me wasn't a house protected by a trust. It was the permission to become the oak tree he always knew I was. And now, my roots are deep, my branches reach for the sun, and I am no longer afraid of the storm, because I have learned that I am the storm. I am the quiet, unwavering strength that has been here all along, just waiting for the rain to fall.